Hello, today we're going to be looking at respiration. So firstly, we'll look at what respiration is, then the respiratory system and the pressure changes involved. So firstly, what is respiration? A lot of people think it's just breathing, but it's not. It includes the cellular parts as well. So respiration is these three things. Firstly, transferring oxygen to the tissues. Secondly, employing the oxygen for the production of energy. And thirdly, transport of carbon dioxide away from metabolically active tissues. So it's getting rid of the waste as well as getting the products, the oxygen and the glucose, to the parts of the body that need it. So there's two stages of respiration, which are gas exchange and cellular respiration. So gas exchange is all about getting the oxygen to the blood and to the tissues and getting the carbon dioxide from the tissues into the blood and then out of the body. Whereas cellular respiration is all about converting the oxygen and glucose to fats, amino acids, and ATP eventually. Now, let's have a look at the structure of the respiratory system. So we're talking about the gas exchange system first of all. The bronchial tree is, so firstly we respire through our lungs obviously, and then the lungs are attached to the body via the bronchial trees, and this is how they're organized. So we talk about the 23 or 24 generations of the bronchial tree. So we have the mouth would be up here, and then going down into the trachea. So the trachea would be the generation number 0, and it has rings of cartilage around it to keep it open, otherwise it would collapse, a bit like the esophagus, which doesn't have any rings, so it just collapses. So this has cartilaginous rings to keep it open. And the first generation is the main bronchi, so the two main bronchi. And then we have the lobar bronchi and the segmental bronchi. This line should really be down here, shouldn't it? But yeah, so we have all the divisions. So there's 4 generations from the trachea to the segmental bronchi, and these generations contain cartilage. The tubes get narrower, shorter, and more numerous as you go down the bronchial tree. Now, from generation 4 onwards, we don't have any cartilage, so this is bronchioles, and that splits into from 4 to about 16 terminal bronchioles, and then from 17 onwards, this is the respiratory zone, so where gas exchange happens. And it's a bit confusing because terminal bronchioles comes before respiratory bronchioles, but that's just how it is. So terminal bronchioles split into the respiratory bronchioles, and then respiratory bronchioles split into alveolar ducts, which then lead on to the alveolar sacs. So there's generation 0 to generation 24 generations there. Now, these generations are split into the conducting and the respiratory zone. So the conducting zone is the first 17 generations. This is where only bulk flow happens, and it's called anatomical dead space. So it's a very small space compared to the respiratory zone because of all the branching and the alveoli that expand down here. The first 17 generations of the conducting zone is 150 milliliters only. No gas exchange takes place here, and there's bulk flow through this area. In this anatomical dead space, if there's no gas exchange, why do we need it? Well, we need it to warm and humidify the air, distribute the air to the depths of the lungs, so we need a passage to bring the air downwards into the lungs and remove dust and bacteria, so for defense. The terminal bronchioles are the smallest airways without gas exchanging capability. So when we get to the terminal bronchioles, they can't exchange gas, but then when we get to 17 generation, that is the respiratory bronchiole, and that's the first place which can exchange gas. The conducting zone vascular system has a bronchial circulation, which allows gas exchange at the levels of the tissues making up the conducting zone. So this has its own blood supply. Now, the respiratory zone is the last 7 generations, and this is a lot more voluminous than the anatomical dead space or the first conducting zone. So this has around 2.5 to 3 litres of volume. This is where diffusion occurs and where your gas exchange happens, so where oxygen enters the blood from the alveoli and where the carbon dioxide goes the opposite direction. So this has a large cross-sectional area, which reduces the airflow, so it slows down the airflow to allow time for this to happen. And the advantage is that the inhaled dust and pollutants settle out prior to the alveoli, so they settle out within this anatomical dead space before they can get to the alveoli. What are alveoli? These are gas exchanging units of the respiratory system, and diffusion within them is very rapid. So let's look at how the total cross-sectional area changes with respect to airway generation. So we've got 0 to 23 here, and in the conducting zone, the cross-sectional area gets slightly bigger because all these, so we have the trachea, and then all these are branching off and increasing the cross-sectional area gradually. And then as we get to the terminal bronchioles and then cross over into the respiratory zone, the cross-sectional area increases massively. And why is this increase important? Because of diffusion. So diffusion occurs across a sheet of tissue, and the rate of diffusion is proportional to the area of the sheet and inversely proportional to the thickness of the sheet. So basically, if you want something to diffuse fast, you want a thin and very large surface area sheet. And this is governed by Fick's law of diffusion. So in general cases, this says that flow of X, of solute X, equals the capillary area times the permeability of X times the delta concentration X, so the concentration of X in the capillary minus concentration of X in the interstitial fluid. If you want more of that, you can check out my cardiovascular tutorials. But in this case, Fick's law would say that net flux equals the concentration 1, so for example, concentration in the alveolus, minus concentration 2, so where it's diffusing to, so for example, concentration of oxygen in the blood, times the area over the thickness times d, which is the diffusion coefficient. Don't really need to worry about that. So what this is saying is basically a short diffusion distance optimizes gas exchange, and larger area does as well. And we can see this here. So this is a capillary endothelium on the inside, interstitial fluid between the endothelium and the alveolus, and a capillary, the inside of a capillary with a red blood cell here. And this would represent the pulmonary circulation. So oxygen is diffusing out and carbon dioxide is diffusing in, and there's only a 0.5 micrometer space, so very small space between the alveolus and the capillary, and the capillary wall is made up of one single layer of endothelial cells, which reduces the thickness. So there's a very intimate relationship between the alveoli and the pulmonary circulation, which is important to increase the rate of diffusion. Now, from birth to adolescence, the number of alveoli increase and the size increases as well. But from adolescence onwards to adulthood, the size increases, so your alveoli get bigger, but the number stays constant, so you don't grow any more alveoli. And this is just saying, this is basically Darcy's law. If you watch my cardiovascular videos, you'll know what that is. So it's flow is proportional to delta P, which is the pressure difference over R resistance. And this can otherwise be written as delta P times K, where K is proportionality constant, which is inverse to resistance. Let's have a look at the structure of the lungs and how it facilitates breathing. So we have the ribcage, the thoracic wall, and then we have a space in between. So and then we have the lungs. So the space in between is actually called the pleura. Well, firstly, there's the mediastinum, which is the space between the pleural cavities, and then we have a double layer of pleura. So we have visceral pleura on the inside, which makes contact with the lung, and parietal pleura on the outside. And these two pleura are actually continuous with each other at the lung hilum. So imagine that a bag is just enveloped over the lung, but there's a very small space in between those two pleura. Now there's visceral pleura and parietal pleura. There's a 10 micrometer thick fluid layer between those two pleura, and the intrapleural pressure is negative, so about 5 centimeters of water. This is subatmospheric pressure, so it's negative compared to the atmosphere, which is about 760 millimeters of mercury. And so whenever we're talking about pressure, if the pressure is negative with respect to the atmospheric pressure, then it's basically like sucking, so it's like a vacuum, it sucks something. And if it's positive, then it's pushing. So hopefully that's quite intuitive for you. That's just the way that I like to think about it. So what keeps the lungs inflated? Firstly, the elastic recoil forces of the chest wall. So the chest wall wants to expand out, and the lungs want to collapse in, basically. So if there was not this layer in between, then that's what would happen. But this layer in between, because the thoracic cavity is airtight, there's this layer in between with negative pressure, which sucks those two layers together and stops the lungs collapsing and stops the chest wall bounding outwards. Under normal conditions, the intrapleural pressure is subatmospheric. It's a result of the opposing forces between the chest wall and the lung. The underlying mechanism of inspiration is to increase the thoracic cage volume. So when you're inspiring, you increase the thoracic cage volume, and because it's airtight, it will suck air in. Normally, this is an active process, so diaphragm contraction expands the thoracic cavity in the vertical axis, and external and anterior internal intercostals contract. We have respiratory accessory muscles as well, which raise the sternum and widen the thorax, so your whole thoracic cavity gets bigger. And if you've seen the experiment with the diaphragm and the bell jar, you'll know what's going on here. But basically, because it's airtight, increasing the volume will increase the volume of the cavities of the lungs inside it as well. And it will decrease the subatmospheric pressure, so it will suck the lungs open. And it will suck air in from the atmosphere. Now, expiration is an increase in intrapleural pressure. Firstly, the respiratory muscles relax, elastic elements of the lung recoil, and this is meant to be a passive process, so it's not meant to require a lot of effort unless you're exhaling really forcefully, in which case you'll need your accessory muscles of respiration, but otherwise it's passive. So eupnea is the passive process of quiet respiration. Accessory muscles raise the diaphragm and increase ventilation where required. Let's look at the pressure gradient. So the transmural pressure is the inside minus the outside. So if you're breathing out, for example, then the transmural pressure will be positive because the inside would be higher pressure than the outside, so it's forcing air out, where it would be negative the other way around. So the trans-total system pressure, so if we have PA on the inside of the lungs, PB on the outside, and PL, which is the interpleural pressure, then the trans-total system pressure would be PA minus PB. The trans-chest wall pressure would be PPL minus PB. And the transpulmonary pressure would be PA minus PL. So notice that it's always from inside minus outside. And basically anything positive is forcing air out, anything negative is sucking air in. Now, pressure changes during the breathing cycle. So at the end of expiration, muscles are relaxed and alveolar pressure should be 0. So it should be atmospheric pressure. The average pleural pressure is minus 5 centimeters of water. And the transpulmonary pressure, so remember transpulmonary is PA minus PPL. So that would be 0 minus 5, which is 5 centimeters of water. That would be positive, and it's important to have a positive transpulmonary pressure because that keeps the lungs inflated in normal breathing. So you can think of increasing transpulmonary pressure as increasing inflation. Let's have a look at pleural pressure and how that changes. So during its inspiration, we start at minus 5. So at the end of expiration, basically here, muscles are relaxed, we're at minus 5. And then pleural pressure, as we breathe in, we decrease the pleural pressure because we expand the thoracic cavity, we suck air in, and it goes down to about minus 8 centimeters of water. Then when we expire, we increase the pleural pressure, so it becomes less negative because we are pushing. We push the inside and squeeze air out. And it goes back to minus 5. And the alveolar pressure, this will decrease as we inspire because again, it's sucking air in because it's under the influence of the pleural pressure. As the thoracic cavity expands, the alveoli suck air in from the atmosphere. And then when we expire, the alveolar pressure increases because obviously we're pushing the air out. Let's look at flow rate. So negative flow in this case just means the air coming into the lungs. So obviously the air will come in as we inspire and then it will go out as we expire. And then tidal volume. Normal tidal volume, maximum tidal volume is about 0.5 litres. So as we inspire, tidal volume increases, and then as we expire, tidal volume decreases. Now, pneumothorax. So I said that all of this depends on the thoracic cavity being airtight, basically, because the pressure changes, the intrapleural pressure changes need to transfer to the alveoli pressure changes. But if the airtight thoracic cavity is punctured, so for example, if someone gets stabbed, they get a stab wound, then the negative pressure within the interpleural space is lost. So what that means is that the chest wall wants to bound out, the lungs want to collapse in because there's not that sucking pressure in between the interpleural space. So the lungs collapse and decrease in volume because of the inward directing elastic coil. Now the chest wall expands outwards, and accidental pneumothorax can be very devastating because of this, because if you don't have that pressure, that airtight cavity, you can't breathe. And if someone does get stabbed, not all hope is lost because the mediastinum, the chest cavity, is divided into 2 airtight compartments. So if you get stabbed on the right side, the lung might deflate on the right, but you still have your left lung intact, so you can still exchange gas. Obviously, if both sides are punctured, then that's not good. So, as we saw before, inspiration is when the pressure in the alveoli decreases below the atmospheric pressure, so 760 millimeters of mercury, or 0 centimeters of water. So that sucks air in, and in expiration, the pressure in the alveoli is greater than the air pressure, so it pushes air out. And that all happens because of the diaphragm and increasing and decreasing the volume of the thoracic cavity. Now flow, this is just another way of writing Darcy's law, but in the case of air and the lungs. So flow equals pressure of the atmosphere minus pressure of the alveoli divided by resistance. Flow depends on the generation of a pressure gradient, which is caused by the intrapleural pressure decreasing because the thoracic cavity expands.